Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for being here at the dying end of this conference. My approach to this talk is more about people to people and what we do locally. I am an Indigenous person from the north of Australia, so could I please indulge you into beginning how we would normally begin in Australia. And this is to say, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the land of the Turkic people. I'm not sure who was here first, but the amazing culture that you see all around you, the way they've looked after their country, the way they've looked after their land, and the way they have made it possible for people from all over the world to come and meet and greet and to create and foster understanding on their land is a very beautiful thing. And the three middle-aged, little overweight Pacific people who have been here have been very lucky to have yes, some wonderful young Turkish people to take us around and show us their beautiful country and the amazing hospitality that they have shown. And if this is the way you conduct business here, then we certainly have something to take back to our lands as well, because this is part of our culture and this is the way we do it. I'd also like to acknowledge my Indigenous sisters from Canada, which is also something that we do. And they had a beautiful presentation on Canada at the start. So it's nice to start with Indigenous people and end with Indigenous people. Nothing in the middle, but that's okay. It's like a bit like a sandwich. So the thing that we are talking about, or the issue that we are going to consider here, or I've been asked to talk about, is interfaith and why we have interfaith. What's the purpose of interfaith in a local setting? And I think in a group like this, it's almost self-evident that people should talk about issues. But for us at a local level, interfaith is about bringing communities together when there are periods of difficulty and using periods of better times to create friendships, to create relationships, and to foster lines of communication, so that when there are times of strife that we are able to come together. It's not purely a pragmatic approach. Interfaith is not about changing people's views about their own spiritual processes. The interfaith normally is seen as Abrahamic, but in Australia, because we have, or we think anyway, that we are the longest continuing civilization on the planet. We have been there on that continent for 60,000 years. We believe that our Creator first put us there and that we have had a continuing relationship with the land and with our communities around for all that period of time. And the major Abrahamic faith, which is Islam, recognizes this because it says that God sent to every people a prophet. So while the prophets that are mentioned in the texts are mainly in the Middle East, the prophets of Israel and the Arabian prophets and the non-Arabian prophets around here, we know from those texts as well that that reinforce our belief that we have been there and that we have been a civilized people for a long time. The interfaith groups in Australia, sometimes people say that they're old people who have nothing better to do with their time and they sit together and have scones and drink tea and don't do anything else. I think that's not always true. We drink coffee as well. But what we do have is we create links between people. So when there are problems, that we can call each other and say, look, there's been an issue. I remember once there was a Christian pastor and his wife who had been set alight in India. And the Hindu community in Canberra, where I live, were quite worried about the impact on their community. And all the communities, the Jewish community, the Muslim community, the Buddhist communities, most of the religious communities went to the temples and spoke to people who were around there, and there were some demonstrations outside as well. So, were able to speak to the demonstrators. The other issue was during the Bosnian War, our Serbian brothers and sisters who had lived in the region for a long time felt under siege. And so we took turns to attend their services so that they wouldn't feel, impacted overly by people from, because of wars overseas. And the same thing with our Jewish brothers and sisters when there were war in Gaza, for example, recently. There was a lot of stuff in the press and anger. And so we made sure that we attended the synagogue regularly with people and made sure that Arab and non-Arab people did also attend those sessions as well. And in return, when there have been problems with the Muslim community, and we are the biggest users of this, there's a lot of problems with the Muslim community because of the situation at the moment, we have support from other people who come to the jamis and the mosques and speaks with our Hajjahs and, generally have a kind of communication that helps to respond to fair right-wing commentary in the press, for example. The idea of interfaith is mainly sometimes to diffuse the strong and harsh dichotomies that appear in the press. So, for example, politicians are very good at taking an example and amplifying it so that they get their space in the sun. And, quite often it's quite disingenuous use of other people's suffering. So if there's a bombing in Paris, they're all je suis Charlie and je suis Paris and stuff like that. But you don't get the same amount of empathy if there's a bombing in Beirut or Jerusalem or in Chechnya or in Russia or in Moscow. It's quite partial. And as interfaith communities, it's possible for us to try and help to bring some nuance to say that, yes, people are people. We are all the children of Adam and Eve, and we suffer and we feel pain equally, and we shouldn't privilege the pain of one group over the other, and to do so without diminishing the pain of one group or the other. This land had the great poet Rumi, who said that the world is a very strange place because we are, in the view of the Abrahamic faith, the created. We have been created, and we see each other, even though in his view we are an illusion. Who created us is an almighty creator who is unseen. We, therefore, are very familiar with the unreal, but we find it difficult to imagine the real, which is the creator himself, whereas we are the created and we are not quite real in his view. I guess the idea of being able to sit together and talk about things is to remind each other that there are difficulties, that we do face difficulties, and in those times of difficulties, sometimes what needs to be said is not said because it is not self-evident. And having somebody to be able to call up from another community and say, look guys, the press is calling us up and asking us all these questions, can we send them on to you, and can you respond on behalf of the broader community? And so you get some kind of moderation, and with that moderation comes less of a backlash, I guess. And if you think that this is a pragmatic approach to the world, well, I guess it is. But what you do also get is in times of when there aren't a lot of problems, where you can sit down with a rabbi or with a priest or with a Buddhist priest or a Hindu scholar or a Muslim scholar to be able to go through the hermeneutics of their own faiths. And there were three men. Unfortunately, it seems to be men all over here, but and the people I'm talking to you about are men as well. The Hajjah of the Canberra Mosque, which is Ahmed Yusuf, the lay rabbi, Mr. Bill Arnold, and Professor James Hare, who was the head of a Protestant group, got together and said, look, we need to examine the hermeneutics of our texts of our various religious texts, because many people who subjectively believe that they're doing right but create a lot of strife in our communities are referring to and deferring to these texts, but according to their own subjective views of these texts. And in creating this series of conferences along the way have helped to educate many people within the broader community, so that when these issues do arise in times of strife, that people are able to give not just black and white answers, but perhaps more complex, more nuanced answers to what they are. As we had an Aboriginal elder who's a beautiful woman who's in her 80s, and she used to always say that, you know, the darkest of the dark night can't extinguish the smallest of the lights, that the embers that survive in the fireplaces till at the end of the night, you know. And it's difficult to imagine, but if you think of the Australian bush and the Australian desert, where there is nothing for, you know, literally hundreds of miles around, you're sitting in the middle of the desert. It's beautiful red during the day, and at night it is pitch black, apart from the campfires that the people light. And at about 2 or 3 in the morning, you see nothing but just tiny embers that radiate, and you see the red of the earth around it glowing in a particular kind of way. And her view is that discussion and understanding are like this. The darkest and the deepest of the dark night can't extinguish that little light. And so Interfaith, and what we try to do, is to have these little lights, not just in our country, not just in the Pacific, but we hope all around the world, where all these tiny little lights will get together and perhaps create a light which will dispel the darkness in the eyes of, and in the words of Rumi as well. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for having us in your beautiful country, and thank you for giving me the opportunity of speaking to you. Thank you very much.